The next morning, Bobby explained to me that he was ready to run away from home. I had never asked about the backpack. He had always brought one with him when he knew that he was going to sleep at someone else's house. It hadn't occurred to me that he was being serious. I asked, "Where are you going to go?" "California," he replied nonchalantly, as if getting there was as easy as hitching and finding grocery stores with soda machines out front. Laughing, I said, "You have no money. How will you get there?" His face contorted when I mentioned money. Not wanting to ruin his chance at a ride by being an asshole to me, he asked, "Can you take me to my aunt's house at least?" I said, "Sure." I knew that she lived only a couple of towns away, a far cry from his imagined California, but it was slightly closer to his goal of being away from his home, his parents, or whatever consequences he had to face here in Massachusetts. During the drive, he was mostly silent. He appeared to be wool gathering. Then, strangely, he took out a pair of ski goggles from his bag and put them on. Half of his face was obscured by them. I thought he was being funny. I asked, "What are you doing?" He said, "I need a disguise in case the local cops are looking for me." This piqued my interest. I wondered, had he recently committed another crime that he hadn't told me about? Was I contributing to the delinquency of a minor again? What more trouble can I get in because of this person, whom is not a god to be worshipped, but a boy, thinking that a pair of ski goggles would be subterfuge enough to fool a police officer who might by chance be looking for him? And not just that, he believed there was some sort of warrant out for him that made him a big-time criminal. I realized that I shouldn't have helped him at all. I should have left him to wallow in whatever consequences he was facing. We reached his aunt's house, and he got out without saying goodbye or even thank you. I went home that afternoon with a strange resolve. He does not matter as much anymore. My brother had brought Anthony and Bill over to have some beers and watch movies. Sitting there amongst my real friends, I had an epiphany. Being horny and lustful are not the same things as being in love. They may accompany love, but they are not the same thing. I was both in love and horny for this person. I must separate the two and forget about this person and move on. The phone rang. It was Bobby's number. I picked it up somewhat out of curiosity, and somewhat because my resolve and epiphany were still brand new and had to have time to settle in. "Hello? My parents are getting a divorce, and all is well with the world." He must have gone home eventually after his parents had discovered where he went. What? What? It's all over. My dad's moving out. I could tell that he was excited at the prospect of two people ending a marriage that had lasted over 30 years. He had always painted his father as some sort of villain in a play all about him, and now he was telling me that the villain would be leaving his life. Aside from his father's strong proselytizing and loud voice, I had seen no evidence that this man was a person who would ever abuse a child. Merely a father who wanted his son to stop being a jackass. Bobby giggled like a child and then hung up. I worried that I had facilitated this turn of events, as most young people do when it comes to divorces. This divorce wasn't even tangentially related to me. Then I remembered my own parents' admonishments. It's never the kid's fault. I went to sleep wondering if this meant that Bobby and I would be hanging out more. I was torn. After all, he was bad news and would only keep abusing me. But on the other hand, deep inside of me, it meant that there still might be a small chance that he could, you know. The next morning there was a knock at my door. Hungover, I answered. It was a police officer, the same one that had asked me down to the station the day of the robbery. I was racked with fear. I mustered, "Yes, officer?" He said, "The chief would like to speak to you." "Am I under arrest?" "No," he said as if I were stupid, and shook his head. "He's just got a few questions for you." I realized much later that he was more likely annoyed at the fact that I understood the law, that if I asked "Am I under arrest?" he was required to tell me the truth. In which case, if I wasn't under arrest, I did not have to go anywhere, the police station or otherwise. But I went anyway out of curiosity, and sat before the police chief's desk, alone, waiting for him to lumber in and ask me whatever it was he needed to ask me. He made me wait at least an hour before he came in. I suppose he wanted me to worry. I wasn't worried anymore, merely amused. If he were going to arrest me, or it were some sort of big trouble, he would have come in already. He won't make me sweat this out. Upon entering the room, he sat in his big chair, which creaked and groaned at his gravitational demands on it. His American flag fluttered as he sat. "Atticus," he said like an official, "do you know why we are here?" What is it with adults and asking this question? We always know why we're here. I shook my head anyway, because it might be a different reason than I had thought. You pushed your friendship with Bobby to the limit, and now you're no longer allowed to see him. My guilty conscience spoke. Did Bobby make some sort of report about me? Is it illegal to watch someone sleep? I never touched him. I was just in love. I asked, why? Bobby's father has realized that the worst things that happen to his son happen when you're around. That's not true, I thought. I said, what happened now? Pretending I didn't know that I had helped him escape from his home the other night. I was glad that it had not been Bobby who did this. Bobby's father has issued a restraining order against you, and if you're within 100 feet of him, you'll be arrested. I was blatantly being told that I was the problem. The myriad conflicting thoughts I had in that moment were a storm cloud of rage, relief, pain, anxiety, and many other things that I could not fully describe. The officer then did a strange thing, much like the proselytizing Mr. Bobby had done. He began to speak about how my life was not over. I needed to keep clean until my trial date and make sure that I avoided Bobby, at least until he was 18. Everything was vague platitudes, and I sat in silence until he was done. When I left, I felt only sorrow. The roads were bright, blinding white that I could not quite stare at. I felt a new thing that would only worsen over the next few years. My heart raced, yet my hands began to go slightly numb. The non-feeling only made this sort of panic attack all the stranger. Sick stomach pains roiled up through me. I had heartburn. When I got home, I ignored my friend's pleas, asking what was wrong, what had happened, and I began to write at the living room coffee table. With a pen in hand, I scrawled in my chicken scratch a letter that, while it ended my friendship with him completely and sent me into the throes of depression, was the best thing that I could have ever done. It was for Bobby's father, though unconsciously, it was for Bobby too. The exact words again are lost to time and memory, but it went something like this. Dear Mr. Bobby, please read all of this before you pronounce judgment on me and tear it asunder. What I have to say is not a trite thing, when in fact it was. You've taken from me the only person that I ever really cared about. Then several paragraphs lamenting this loss, along with casual vague references to suicide and ambiguous references to love, without saying outright that I was in love with his son, and of course, more apologies for my infractions. It was the most tormenting and disgusting 25-cent word-pinching thing that I had ever written. I honestly had no idea what the outcome would be. Signed Atticus, forever your son's friend. With this, I folded the 2-page letter and handed it to Bill, whom I asked to put it in Bobby's mailbox. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this. He read some of it while standing there with a queer smile on his face. His eyebrows raised, he said, "Okay," in that sarcastic way people do when they're unsure of a course of action, but are gonna pick one anyway. I waited for him to return, festering, roiling, with fear and sadness. He did, and he explained that Bobby was standing on the doorstep, and he had handed it to him, rather than his father, or put it in the mailbox. While upset that it hadn't gone how I planned, I felt a little better. The numbness in my hands and palpitations were gone. I called Bean to explain what had happened, crying foolishly into the corded phone. She listened intently and painfully, then said, "You've got to get over it. Why don't you come over?" What more can I eke out of this relationship, I thought. We hadn't even had a moment of truth where I could tell him how I really felt. But he already knows how you feel. It's possible that the reason I was so upset at the time had less to do with the loss of Bobby in my life as the fact that the choice had been made for me. I hated adulting. If being an adult meant that I had to accept that sometimes you just had to do what you were told, then I didn't want to. To be a good teenager, you must always say how everything is unfair, and it's never your fault, because adults had made all the decisions until now. Why all of a sudden is it all our fault the moment a certain day passes by? You have to make waves of drama that radiate through your life and are remembered throughout its entirety, otherwise things will get boring. To be a good Christian teenager means accepting responsibility for everything, your thoughts, your feelings, the way you treat others. It doesn't sound so bad until you realize that you're constantly culpable for every little thing that you do. Did I blaspheme by worshiping another god? I hope not, and I confess it all to the open air. If you don't, you must be a bad person. How bad would this have turned out had I been born just a decade later, had I not been at the tail end of Generation X, and instead had been a part of the millennial generation, where the internet wasn't just a cute toy that was up and coming, and my life would have been hit the ground running or else. Before nerdy was considered sexy, all of it may have gone viral and not been at the snail's crawl of mouth to ear, in a telephone game that never left my little town. I'm glad it happened the way it did. I replied yes to Bean and tried as hard as possible to move on. Weeks passed and I started to feel better, but not that much. Working third shift was taking its toll on me, as I could not sleep when I got home. Wired and tired, I would drink to excess in order to find respite from my sleeplessness. I hung out with Bean almost every day, every once in a while asking after Bobby. How was he? Does he ask about me? Does he miss me? She chided me for not asking after Aiden, whom I had forgotten. I had visited him, but as I began to explain what happened to me, he had laughed and said that I was more boring than ever. She and the other friends said that's his way of saying that he's interested. He's just trying to get a rise out of me. I had had enough with people like that, and I told him as much and left. He's not going to tell you how much he hurts, how much he feels, because he's stuck in there and you're on the outside, she said. And the sick will comfort the well as they always have and always will. I would later think that about the loss of many friends, but he was the first. Then she had let it slip that she hung out with Bobby recently, then regretted it immediately. I asked, why does he sneak out to hang out with you guys and not me? I mean, I get it, he doesn't want to get in trouble, but she cut me off. No, Eddie, no. And she had a pained look on her face. What is it? What's wrong? My interest was piqued, all nerves, all neurons, all of my cerebral cortex was inundated with the question. She took in a deep breath and said, I said to him because you asked me to, that you had said hi, and he said, oh yeah? Well, you can tell him that I hate him and I never want to see him again. I could believe what I was hearing, but it was frightening and cathartic. In my silence, she continued, he read that letter you wrote his father and thinks that you're gay and in love with him. He never gave it to his dad, he just threw it away. That feeling came again. My hands went numb, my face went numb, and I couldn't breathe. She asked if I was okay. I lied yes, but she didn't believe me. This must be how Aiden feels. 5 months thereafter were spent in a daze. I visited Aiden several times and brought him books, pretending I was okay all the while. Sometimes he would chide, miss your boyfriend? I told him that I hated Bobby. I can't remember if what I was saying was true or not. I wanted this obsession to be over. I did not want to ever feel again. It was around that time that I had my encounter with the Maglite Mauler and had a large scar across my chin that still echoes in the mirror today. Aiden thought that was funny too, just like everything else that had happened. I stuffed my feelings down. As a person with first-hand experience of mental illness, I can tell you that most people would rather ignore it. Aiden was a living, breathing expression of that in my life. Through him, I learned what people were willing to put up with and what they weren't. So by his example, I internalized my issues, ignoring them and pretending that they weren't there. I didn't want anyone to see who I was anymore. The outcome of the letter had also substantiated my beliefs about people, that they were not trustworthy. If all I had to do was to give someone a momentary glimpse into my mind, my heart, and they no longer wanted to know me or be friends with me, then I would no longer share those things. If having people in my life who wanted to be around me meant that I had to pretend that everything was okay, then that was what I would do. Trouble is, my internal monologue had become a soup of religious sentiments, gay pornographic fantasy, and a constant malaise or hypochondriasis, depending on the day. But I don't want to let them know anything is wrong. Don't let them know. I was able to keep a full-time job, lose weight and keep it off without starving myself, and create the perfect subterfuge so no one would ask what was wrong. Occasionally, they would see me talking to myself, but most of my friends and loved ones wrote it off as just me being me. I suppose that this is how all people become adults, that through their peers they discover what is and isn't acceptable in daily life, and being mentally ill is unacceptable. Unfortunately, this silence can only make one appear to be functional, and that's what I was, outwardly functional. It didn't stop with masking my feelings. I also masked my physical appearance and behaviors. I began to keep my tones low so that I wouldn't appear effeminate. This was compounded by the fact that I began to dress in more expensive clothing that had a manly feeling to it. Jeans with thick belts, shit-kicker boots, and solid-colored t-shirts that clung tightly to the considerable chest that I had built up. I avoided pop music while driving and in the presence of others, listening only to metal and occasionally hip-hop like the Wu-Tang Clan and Tupac Shakur. I didn't realize it, but I was in a manic state, making more decisions that were destructive. I had purchased a newer sports car that I could barely afford to make payments on, insure, or even put gas in. However, it was fast, loud, and masculine. That's all that mattered. On July 4th of that year, with my thinness, my confidence, my new car, my new haircut, my new clothes, and my new attitude, I hoped that I appeared intimidating to Bobby. Rick and another friend of mine had convinced me to go to a local fair with rides and fireworks. I needed to be convinced because I told him there was a distinct possibility of seeing Bobby there. But it wasn't because I was scared of seeing him after so long, I swear. It was like I had just come off of some drug, love, and was in recovery, and he was trying to put my face in it, again, just to tempt me. When a small town throws a party like this, it's actually quite enjoyable. The night sky was ignited by the carnival, and no stars could be seen, and the teenagers came out to play. When the clamor in my head about how worried I was had died down, I could hear loudspeakers playing the latest pop songs, crowds of people intermingled like the tangled web of cotton candy on a stick. They spent money that they shouldn't, on things that they shouldn't, for just a momentary reprieve from being functional. I caught a glimpse of him on one of the rides, the Sidewinder, and walked quickly in the other direction. At that moment, I really needed some fried dough. I scarfed it down and realized that my usual custom of smoking right after eating would have to wait. I had run out of cigarettes. I left Rick to throw darts at balloons for small prizes and walked briskly to the nearest gas station. On the way there, I stopped dead in my tracks at a very sad sight. Sitting there on the sidewalk under a street lamp, looking shabby and sleepy, was Bobby, idly smoking a cigarette. I had mistaken the earlier person on the ride for him and felt a pang of fear that I swallowed. This Bobby was very different. Instead of the vibrant, beautiful, youthful young man that I had fallen in love with, there was a gaunt shell of a boy with deep-socketed eyes that's hands shook when he took the cigarette out of his mouth. The tips of his hair had been bleached and grown out considerably, like he didn't care for haircuts anymore. Then suddenly he called out, "Atticus Blake!" like an announcer calling out the prize winners, then clapped his hands together. That fear that I had swallowed earlier radiated throughout my chest. I began to walk forward and felt my facade melting away. If anyone could see through it, it would have been him, had he not been drug-addled and tweaked out of his mind. I sat next to him on the sidewalk. "How've you been?" he asked, and then let out a long breath that was usually accompanied by slurred speech. I can't remember much more of the conversation because I had become transfixed with his eyes. Not in that way I had before. It was the dilation of his pupils. There was no color, no blue, and the light was gone. Also in the way his hands shook almost violently when he lifted the smoke. He had the look of a person that had just gotten out of a house fire by just the skin of his teeth and was in need of a blanket. I no longer desired to touch him, kiss him, comfort him, or even ask him what was wrong. Part of me had learned how not to care, and my anxiety had gone away. After all, he had not held to his statement. I hate him and I never want to see him again. He must have had so few friends. Before me was the most pitiable person I could have imagined him to become. I realized why I had mistaken him for the boy on the ride. I was expecting youthfulness and happiness, even if it was at someone else's expense because that person would be functional. This person was not functional, internal or otherwise. I began to wonder what I had ever seen in him. I left him saying my goodbyes. Now I realized that Rick had wanted me to see him in this state. He knew that I would be egotistical, and I would think better of myself. I played games and won prizes, and I laughed like I hadn't in a very long time. I was more than functional. I was happy. We can become deconverted from friends as well as religions. Rick explained in the car on the way home. He's been taking a lot of ecstasy, and he got caught with tons of it. I think he might be going to juvenile lockup. I said, I don't care, and I meant it. And here Bobby leaves this story for more than a decade. Thank you for watching. I hope you've all enjoyed this excerpt from my book. If you want to know the rest of it, you're gonna have to buy it when I'm done writing it, which should be pretty soon now. It might actually be on the order of 300 pages or more. Patrons will get a copy for free, otherwise I'm gonna make it pretty cheap. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe, share it on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, wherever. Also, if you'd like to become a patron of mine, the link is in the description.